and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Michael Goodman. I'm a professor here at Baruch College. I'm the director of the master's program in corporate communication here at Baruch College, and also the director of CCI, Corporate Communication International Research Center, which is also here at Baruch College. We are, both of those programs, and the graduate program and the research center are proud sponsors of this event, Latino PR History. And this is the 10th event that the Public Relations Museum has had over the last 3 years that they've been in residence here at Baruch College. We're here to honor public relations pioneers from the Latino community, as well as the new voices from that community as well. We've already started the buffet and the sangria, so please don't leave any food. We don't want to have to take that home at all. And there will be a networking event, so there'll be enough food afterwards as well. I want to thank our sponsors for tonight, the Hispanic Public Relations Association. I want to thank Hidden City Cafe, Burson-Marsteller, and Shelley's Public Relations Museum, and Specter Associates. We also want to thank Barry Specter, who is behind the camera. So when you see the camera pointing towards you, the light will be on. He will probably pan you a couple of times to get some shots of you in action. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the Dean of Weissman School of Arts and Sciences here at Baruch College, Dean Aldemaro Romero. His bio is on the handout that you have in your folder. Just a few things that are interesting about Dean Romero, and there are a lot of things that are interesting about Dean Romero. He is an avid video blogger. That's not in the bio. That is in the bio, but all the way at the end. He has a degree in biology from the University of Barcelona in Spain, PhD in biology from the University of Miami in Florida. He's published over 900 pieces, academic and otherwise. He's written 20 books. I have a few to go to catch up with the Dean. I'm working on it. Monographs and hundreds of articles in peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed publications. We are lucky to have him here at Baruch College. He comes to us from McAllister College in Minnesota, from the Department of Biological Sciences, excuse me, at Arkansas State University. He was dean at Southern Illinois University in Evansville before he came here last year in 2016. We are very pleased with Dean Romero. He has been an active member of our community. He's been a stimulant for us academically, and he has been an avid supporter of events such as this. And it is my pleasure to introduce him to you, Dean Romero.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. When I learned about this event, I'm sure there was a big smile crossing my face. Not because I thought this was a crazy idea. On the contrary, it's probably someone trying to give me some kind of advice on something. I'm sorry. It was because when I saw the program and I saw the whole theme, it came to my mind the issue of stereotypes. And of course it came because when you think about PR and advertisement, there is this public image that came with this TV series called Mad Men, when you see this bunch of people who spend the whole day drinking, smoking, womanizing, and of course all of them are white males. I'm very happy to see today that the crowd here has nothing to do with those stereotypes. And it's because we are very fortunate to be in a college that is very diverse, and we're trying to make it even more diverse. One of our strongest programs is the corporate communication programs led by Michael with great distinction. And just to reaffirm what I just said with facts, not just with words, is that the School of Arts and Sciences, the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, when I took the helm of that unit, had not had any person doing any marketing whatsoever. And the person that we hired to lead those efforts is a graduate from that program and a Latina. So I just want to emphasize that we are using the real facts and the real actions in order to counter these stereotypes. And she's doing, by the way, a great work. Her name is Omaris Rodriguez. So I want to welcome you on behalf of the school and also at a personal level. As a Latino, I am very pleased to see these things are going on here. And I'm really impressed with the panelists that will be intervening in tonight's event. And again, I hope that you see that what we are doing here in terms of corporate communication is not only important from the subject viewpoint, but also from the social impact that is having in our society. So again, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. How many of you are students currently? Most of you, okay, that's great. When you open up your textbooks that you use in your corporate comms class, how many of you have seen or read about Latinos in PR history? Can anybody name a Latino in PR history? Somebody who's not in this room. Because there's a lot of stars in this room. He's here. Well, we have uncovered a very impressive list, and it's not easy to find, unfortunately, but we are beginning this list of very impressive Latino PR people. And I want to introduce a few of them to you tonight. And also at the Museum of Public Relations, I don't know, how many of you have been to the Museum of Public Relations? A good number of you, that's wonderful. How many of you have been there more than once? Okay, great. We are now, thanks to our keynote speaker, Juan Cappello, and our moderator, Mike Fernandez, starting up the first ever Latino PR History exhibit. And it will be open tomorrow late afternoon with some speeches that Mike Fernandez wrote as the youngest press secretary at Capitol Hill, and Juan Cappello wrote through his 30-year career at ITT, and anybody else who knows of some very important Latino people in this business, please share the papers and photos with me, because we'd love to include it in our exhibit. Again, I think this is very newsworthy and important, and please share this news. We want to encourage more people to know about our history of Latino PR professionals. So anybody recognize anybody on this list here? Okay, that's good. Any students recognize anybody on this list? Okay, well, this is a guy who died just a few months ago. Really terrific guy. He was a pioneer in public opinion polling, changed the way that the political system was interviewing Hispanics and Latinos across the country. He was the first person to try to interview them in Spanish. Now imagine, they never did that before. So the polling was inaccurate. And now this is done all the time, as a matter of fact, right? So he was a real pioneer in that. Joe Ortiz was the first Latino to host an English language talk show in the US, and he was the founder of the California Chicano News Media Association. Plus, he founded a public relations agency, and he did a lot of campaigns pro bono, such as for the Boy Scouts and the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Manuel Alonso. Manuel was one of the first PR professionals in all of Mexico, and he actually began his career at age 11 writing for news services such as UPI in Mexico. And he later opened his own PR firm and represented a lot of US-based corporations such as American Express, P&G, and Pfizer. Next, we have Julie Mendez, and I'm sure some of you remember her. She was on the board of the Hispanic PR Association. loved it, highly devoted, and she died suddenly at age 32 last year. She had worked for Edelman. Then we have Don Padilla. Anybody hear of the firm Padilla and Spears? Very well-known old firm, started up in the 70s in Minneapolis. And of course, we all called it Padilla, and anybody who knows Spanish knows that it was really Padilla. I didn't know that until Mike told me that a few weeks ago. But the firm, what's interesting about this firm is undergone so many different acquisitions and different reincarnations of itself, and today it has rebranded itself and it's just Padilla. That is the name of the firm, just Padilla, no Spears anymore, no CRT anymore. Here we have William Velasquez. He's a very impressive person as far as organizing the Southwest Voter Registration Education Program, which took the very under-registered voting population in the Southwest, and which was 2.4 in 1974, and he increased it sevenfold just by getting out the vote efforts. One of his lines, which became very famous, was, "Your vote is your voice." And that I'm sure there's a Spanish way of saying it. I'm not going to attempt to do that, but this became very, very important to getting out the Latino vote. Last is Diana Munatones. She had the highest ranking Latino TV program in the United States. 1977, she was actually on the air and was a producer on the Today Show. Many of you may recognize her face. And she later served under President Carter in the Foreign Policy Advisory Commission. So I'd like to take all this information, and you have it available to you here. And what the museum is going to do is send this to every textbook publisher around the world, like Prentice Hall, etc., to make sure that they begin including Latinos in their PR history chapters. What do you say to that? And who's going to help me do that? Okay, it's my honor now to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Juan Cappello. Juan is a journalist and entrepreneur, a former managing partner for Hill & Knowlton Latin America, just a few things over his life. But perhaps Juan is best known for being the first Latino to ever be appointed Chief Communications Officer for a US-based Fortune 500 company, a little company called ITT. But he'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Juan was kind enough to donate his papers, books, photos, and whatever else to start our exhibit tomorrow. And I hope that you all will make appointments to come and visit and take pictures and send them out on social media. This stuff is fascinating. So let's give a hand to Juan, and then I'll be back to introduce our next speaker.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was a very nice introduction. Thank you, Shelley. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to sound a little bit overwhelming, but to share this moments with you, I consider it a personal honor and also a professional privilege. And these are not just nice and empty words. I mean it. You see, the evening is happening at Baruch College with all its educational prestige, but also with one of the most diverse student bodies in the country. In many respects, if you analyze it percentage-wise, probably the most diverse in the country. And this is happening during Hispanic Heritage Month. And this is happening while we're opening the Latino wing of the Public Relations Museum. Yes, it's a startup operation, but also let's not forget it's unique around the world. And also Baruch has managed to put together the past, the present of public relations, and most importantly, in my book at least, at this stage in my life, its future, represented today by the graduate students of the school, by the students that are here today. So, as I said, those were not empty words. I meant them. This is a very special night, and on behalf of Jean, of some very dear friends that came to join us today, and myself, I want to thank you all for allowing us to be part of it. The organizing committee asked me to share with you some of my personal experiences, some of my extraordinary personal experiences. In the PR profession, when the profession was young. Some of those experiences, I'm amazed to say it, but go back as far as 50 years. 50 years is half a century. If I were a car, I'd be an antique. But in those days, ladies and gentlemen, and I say this with pride, I was an immigrant. Some of them in those days also referred to us as aliens. And I hope that term was not the inspiration for movies like Star Wars and other things, But and ladies and gentlemen, today I am a U.S. citizen. Among other 50 million citizens with cultural citizens, residents, etc., with cultural roots in Latin America. 37 million of them claim to be bilingual and to speak their languages fluently. They coming from 23 different Spanish and Portuguese speaking nations throughout the continent. Arriving here with different backgrounds, arriving here with different levels of education, different needs and hopes and aspirations. I know the word, the frequent word of the adjective different may be of concern to some people in this group. So I believe it's an important issue. Help me for a second and allow me for a minute to try to explain what I'm getting into. Please, by raise of hands, and this is the seconds that I want you to help me. ¿Cuántos de nosotros somos de o tenemos nuestras raíces en México? Si ustedes pueden levantar la mano. Okay. Colombia. Honduras, ¿qué les parece? Bueno, Puerto Rico. Okay. Y para que el decano no se sienta solo, Argentina. Lo siento, decano, parece que está solo, pero no hay problema. Now, the reason to signal our points of origin is because the Latin American community in this country may be presented as monolithic. By the way, a very convenient geopolitical tool for us to use during election times. Let's not forget that, and let's not change that. But all of us know that the history of each one of our countries is different. And remember, I didn't say worse or better. I'm using the word different. The social realities in our countries are different. The levels of education in our countries are different. Income, historical democratic stability vary from one nation to the other in Latin America. And recognizes those differences don't set us apart, must confess, except during those wonderful international soccer tournaments. But they don't set us apart because no matter what anybody says, ladies and gentlemen, and this applies not only to Latin Americans, but to all immigrants in this country and to other countries. Those differences don't set us apart because most immigrants are united in one common effort to do our jobs well in the country that welcomed us, to contribute to this society as best we can, to assimilate into the American culture. In many cases, including my own, to become citizens, if we so wish. But we do all this while returning the pride for our cultural roots and for who we are. Remember, yes, we did not come over on the same ship. Absolutely right. But today, ladies and gentlemen, we are all on the same boat. So let's not forget that. And let's not forget that I really stole that sentence from a man you know quite well, Mr. Barnard Baruch. Oh. My apologies, but I think I got a little bit excited. My Italian blood and my Latino background got together, and Shelley will probably get mad at me if I don't move along. But so it's back to public relations. I mentioned already the past and the present and the future of the profession being here with us tonight. Well, I'm sure especially the beautiful, intelligent ladies in the room have not noticed this, but I represent the past. And because of that, I believe I know your key question tonight, and I'm going to attempt to answer them with a two-part answer. Yes, absolutely. When I started in public relations decades ago, things were not easy in our profession. In most instances, we were seen, yes, as very good communicators, but not as equal partners. And this did not allow us for professional comfort. It did not allow us for professional growth patterns. And in the businesses we represented, or in the consultancy projects, we were working jointly with other professionals that were recognized as such: attorneys, accountants, investors, sports agents, and so many others. And that presented a serious challenge for us that were starting in the profession, a very serious one. So some of us opted for educating ourselves in each of the activities we represented, from business to ballet, from science to sports, whatever it was. Yet other colleagues went further. They got their law degrees, their MBAs, and the likes. But this is what's interesting. At least in my experience as the one I knew, they did that to grow as PR professionals. And that's very interesting and something that you should keep in mind. Frankly, with that, the careers started opening. I was told to tell the stories of the past, and that's what I'm trying to do. We began to be perceived as equal partners in projects, with one advantage over our counterparts. Public opinion had become relevant, and we knew about public opinion. We knew how to communicate strategically and in a timely basis. So the PR men, after a while, and the PR women, after a while longer, I must confess, unfair as it is, we were invited to take our seats around the conference tables with equal or sufficient knowledge of the matter at hand to suggest viable and hopefully truthful solutions, to communicate them publicly, and in some cases even to take the lead role in the whole process. This may sound quite simple today. I'm telling you right now, it was not. For example, yes, I've been identified as the COO, thankfully, thank you very much, as the first COO in whatever it is in the United States, for the largest corporation, for the largest multinational industry company ever. Well, it took some 15 years of proving myself. It took some 15 years of hard work and results. And it took some serious corporate crises, and some of you will remember some of them, to convince the management and to convince the board and to convince everybody of the need to speak with one corporate voice, to place our public opinion venues under one roof, and to work under that same roof with different departments on things like crisis management or on the timely discovery and disclosure of positive developments. So that was my answer briefly to that my first half answer to your question. The second part response is, again, yes, absolutely. For a Latin American immigrant joining the field decades ago, things were even a little bit more complicated. But I have to confess that not because of open anti-Latin American, anti-immigration, anti-immigrant discrimination, but because of other reasons that we'll discuss later on. Now, must confess it will be naive of me to believe that there was no resentment against this newcomer. But discrimination, that's because discrimination unfortunately existed then, exists now, and not only in the United States, but the world over. What I'm trying to point out is that being a Latin American, we were not special targets. We were treated pretty much like women, like African Americans and other groups breaking into different professional markets at the time. Fortunately, something that we tend to forget in the heat of the discussions about discrimination, in parallel to ignorant discrimination, then and now we should not forget that many more people, good people exist who oppose that radicalism. And I was lucky, and here, that's another element that made my career. I was lucky to run into quite a number of them as I went to work initially. And I went to work initially, ladies and gentlemen, this is a side comment, as a speechwriter, media relations, third country expatriate. My card couldn't put all those titles in, so. And by the way, I didn't want to have a card because that was the lowest communications level in the international executive career of ITT at the time. That's where I started. Then I have to say my timing in showing up was quite right. Lowest level of professional level or not, my ego did suffer, I must confess, initially, but I had to persevere. I didn't have any choice, and my wife was kind enough to push me in the right direction. It became evident to me also that I had joined a multinational, multi-industry company where Latin American-based operations were starting to become a serious problem. And when there are problems in our business, as you all know, that represents opportunities. PR opportunities. And in my case, that represented opportunities for someone who could communicate well in the region. Not only because of language ability, and we emphasize that language, that's a thing, but because of understanding sociological differences from one country to another that allowed me to face problems in one way different from the other. Further, and I didn't realize this at the time, my then limited knowledge of the business world opened doors for me. Yes, sometimes ignorance pays. Yes, that's true, but please allow me small advice to the younger people here. Trust me, it only pays if it's a passing phenomenon. Don't stay with it. Personally and professionally, I did not want to stay where I had started. It became obvious to me that to move ahead, I needed to learn about business. I needed to learn about ITT business, and we had everything, from parking lots to hotels to insurance companies and you name it. But I had to understand those businesses to be able to opine and try to change the messages that in the beginning business executives from within the company were asking me to structure and deliver, and nothing else. That had to change. My real disadvantage at that stage was that as a newcomer, and this if there are some newcomers here, keep it in mind, I had much more to learn than the next guy. There was no doubt about it, but it took me some time to realize that. So, with Jean's help, as in the privacy of our home, I call her Dr. Jean Cappello because she's a professor. You know, with Jean's help, after work, and remember there were no computers at the time, so things were much longer to happen, I spent many, many hours reading books in libraries. I had to go to the library, read the book, borrow it, whatever it was. Attending seminars, both professional, college, educational, learning the business basics, specifically in the projects ITT was assigning to me in the United States at the time. Now, here's the interesting thing, that with that increased knowledge, and I didn't get an MBA, I just took the courses that I thought I needed to supplement my education. Gradually, I went from being a communications guy into being a business executive, an ITT business executive with expertise in public opinion and corporate communications. And I have to tell you, that was a big difference career-wise. I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't have received all those titles you mentioned if I hadn't decided to move ahead. A few years later, I received assignments in Europe. Yes, I speak Italian and other languages also. In Asia, I don't speak Asian languages. Tonal languages are very difficult to me. The United States, different parts of the world. And those assignments, and this is the interesting thing, and this is the message I'm trying to convey, were not exclusive in the PR communications area. They were business assignments in certain cases that had complications in terms of how to communicate things. And I have to confess, and I never showed my soft belly points, to my opponents. Before each one of these assignments, I reviewed what I knew, and I was honest with myself in terms of trying to learn what I did not know. I have to say, fluency in 3 languages was a huge help for me. What was a disadvantage when I started became an advantage in an international company, okay? But knowledge, the desire to learn about the cultures involved, yes, about the political and business realities of the different countries, even help even more. In Latin America, as an example, the team members I work for in assignments given to me, both at ITT and later in my own consultancy and partnership with WPP of London, most of my colleagues were Americans without profound knowledge of the area, but willing to learn. They came to understand that trying the same solution to the same problem, say in a country like Colombia, and then trying it in Costa Rica, in Paraguay, and then in Peru. Countries with different realities, ladies and gentlemen. Could work sometimes, yes, maybe, but most of the times it didn't. And that if you tried US tailor-made solutions, that was surely a recipe for failure for the very same reasons, but enhanced in this case, different cultures and different realities. You'd be surprised, I consult for companies. I continue to consult for companies, and you'd be surprised how many times to this day computer systems, social media, instant access to information, this umbrella approach in terms of solving communications programs still continues to be pretty much a way to try to do things. In my experience, and with this I'm finishing, when you take an assignment, you do not need to become an overnight expert, but you do need to learn and read a bit of history, okay, to study present realities in a given market, because each market is different. Even in the United States, New York and New Mexico are totally different markets, okay, as an example. You have to know how to reach public opinion sectors that are important to your client. Be realistic on your own limitations, and this is very important. You have to know what your limitations are and what to do about them. Improve on them before you put your communication skills to work. Then, and only then, apply the principle that goes beyond our world of PR, and that applies particularly well to our field. The ability to express an idea is as important as the idea itself. And that phrase I also borrowed from Bernard Baruch. So, ladies and gentlemen, the representative of the past, much to the regret of all the beautiful and intelligent women here, is not going to abuse your patience anymore. I want to close by saying I want to congratulate Baruch. I want to congratulate the organizing committee. And I want to congratulate those representing the present of public relations. You have done and you're doing a great job for our profession. Now a respected and well-established profession, something I didn't find 50 years ago. And to those of you representing the future, tonight, yes, I tried sharing some personal and professional experiences with all of you. But thanks to the work of many, the doubts and stumbles I mentioned in the beginnings are no longer there. You face new challenges, the emergence of social media, etc. But from the professional base from which you operate now, it's a professional base that's solid and well established. Then, ladies and gentlemen, there are no excuses. It is up to you, through imagination, through work, through knowledge, to succeed and to enjoy the work you do. But you must know as much as the people, the companies, the clients you represent to do a real public relations work. Looking around here tonight, I know this will happen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and good night.
I want copies.
Thank you.
I want copies.
I don't have copies, I have
Okay.
notes.
We're going to get copies to everybody out tonight. That was terrific, just wonderful. Okay, so now we've met the first Latino CCO. Guess who the second Latino CCO is? Anybody? Yes, Rosanna.
I'm not sure. Is it Mike?
It's Mike Fernandez, that's right. Now, Mike Fernandez, I think he thought he was the first, but he met Juan and said, no, he's the first. And so Mike is the second. And he started off his career on Capitol Hill as a press secretary, the youngest press secretary ever. And then he worked for 5 companies. So at each of those 5 Fortune 500 companies like Cargill, Cigna, ConAgra, etc., he was the first CCO. And now he is the U.S. CEO for Burson-Marsteller, the public relations agency. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Mike here tonight. And he's going to be introducing our 2 panels. So, Mike, come on up, and let's give a big hand to Mike.
So thank you. And, what I want to do is first thank Baruch College for this opportunity. I think this is terrific. Also was thrilled to share this podium with Juan. And, and one of the things that's kind of funny is that for many years, people would approach me as Juan. And that is, what I mean by that is they assumed that I was the first when I knew indeed he was the first. And it was funny because, we do kind of look alike, right? Actually, we proved the point that Latinos come in various shapes and sizes. But the reason for tonight, I think, is multifaceted. One, we sit at a critical point in the public relations and marketing industries in terms of that there's lots of change, and lots of people tend to focus on the change that's happening with technology. But a big part of the change that's happening in the United States is related to culture. And just as Juan talked about the distinctive nature of Latin American cultures, there's a distinctive nature about the U.S. culture today. I stand before you as a baby boomer. Baby boomers are a little bit more than a quarter racially and ethnically diverse. Millennials, many more millennials in this room than baby boomers, but millennials are more than 40% racially and ethnically diverse. And yet, if I look at my professional history, when I became a chief communications officer for the first time in 1996, there was only one other person who was a CCO, and that was Juan. And today, I look around and I see a lot of friends. I see a lot of people who have similar experiences, maybe a little bit younger, but Latinas and Latinos like Catherine Hernandez, she says Blades, I say Blades, of Aflac, Bob Jimenez at Cox, B. Perez at Coca-Cola, Oscar Suris at Wells Fargo, Rosemary Mercedes, who succeeded Monica Talan at Univision, Roella Santos at Engility, and Margita Thompson at California Resources Corp. So that's all great. But if we take into consideration what's actually happening in agencies and corporations, well, we have a greater number of diverse individuals within the companies and within the agencies. Leadership is still a challenge. And indeed, if you look at leadership across the pane of looking at Latinos, looking at African Americans, looking at Asians, what you find is that leadership positions are only going to about 6.5% of those from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds. So with a population that's sitting today in the US of about 35% in total, racially and ethnically diverse, we've got a long way to go. And as you think about that pathway that we have to go, it's important to know the history. And part of that history is that if we advance to the same degree that we've advanced from when I was first appointed, and I was appointed by another Latino, a gentleman by the name of Saul Trujillo, who actually serves on the WPP board today. But he made me a CCO in 1996. If we improve at the same rate since 1996, it'll be 30 years before we hit that 35% that we see today. So what we need to do is think about how do we accelerate that? How do we get more people to think about how we help others, how we bring them along? So I think tonight is very important. And it's important from the standpoint that we know the data. We know that there's research that says more diverse teams work better, come up with more creative ideas more quickly. Even in an experiment that was done by two economists, one from MIT and one from George Washington University, they separated a group that was male and a group that was female. And they had another group that was equal male and female. And the equal group outperformed the other two. We also have research 2 years ago from McKinsey that actually went through and showed that there was a statistically significant relationship between a more diverse leadership team and better financial performance. Add on to that the marketing construct. So if 35% of the US population and growing is diverse, how do we purport, how do our agencies and corporations purport to connect to that changing population? It's going to take some work. It's going to take a number of the people that we're going to see on the next two panels. So what we've done is the first panel is a panel where we're going to get a view of Latino PR professionals who are kind of at mid-career, making their mark. We want to explore their challenges and pathways in the industry and get their take on what the industry needs to do to become more inclusive and more diverse. So let me ask our first participants to come forward. Yeah, just anyone who... So I believe in your programs there at the table, you actually have the panel participants. And so the participant all the way to my left, your right, is Andy Checco. And Andy Checco is a senior director with Havas Formula. He and I met actually a few years ago when he was the president of the Hispanic Public Relations Association. Next to him, we have Erica Soto-Lam, former CCO of Every Town for Gun. Is that how I say it? Are you the former CCO or?
I'm a senior advisor.
The
founding CCO at Every Town for Gun
There we go. And then Penelope Ramirez, who's with Edelman. And then we have, he dared me to say Michael Sheen. It's Michael Estevez. He's with us at Burson and works in corporate and, Public affairs and crisis. So anyway, what I would love for each of you to first reflect on is what was the biggest challenge that you've had as you've kind of proceeded with your career in public relations? I'll start with you, Mike.
Sure. Since I'll probably get the hardest question since it's my boss asking. I think the biggest challenge for me was there was really no one that I could ask for help. There was no one I could ask questions of. I've been in the business for about 20 years, and I honestly not sure exactly when the Hispanic PR Society was started. If it was in existence, I didn't know about it. The agency that I was associated with at the time didn't have any type of diversity and inclusion initiative. So I felt pretty much on my own. I was first generation in my family to go to college. My sister preceded me. So I did not really have a network of professionals, older adults, aunts, uncles, even friends of the family that I could really approach for advice. So there was a lot of trial and error, painful lessons learned. But I think one of the things that I always stuck to was my father was I grew up in a very conservative Hispanic household. My father is Dominican, and his perspective was you have to be twice as good as everybody else to be considered equal. And so that was, in sum, my challenge.
I come from similar circumstances of not having the resources and being, again, actually, I'm an immigrant child. I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic, and I moved here when I was just barely 15 years old and kind of just stumbling into the industry. However, I was lucky enough to start my career in public relations, working specifically multicultural, focusing on Hispanic consumers. However, one of the biggest challenges that I faced in the beginning of my career was coming to terms with the lack of education and the lack of understanding as to who we are. It was really difficult for me to understand that in this time and age, people still have such wrong perception of who we are and really don't understand not so much what the industry is about, but who this consumer is. The fact that we have the exact same interests and the fact that we have a lot of similarities and that we have very similar lifestyles than our general market counterparts. So to me, to come to terms with the fact that my career wasn't just about being a communicator, but to also be an educator, that was one of the biggest challenges overall, I have to say.
Eric?
I have to echo part of what Michael said, and I was thinking about it earlier today in preparation for coming here tonight. Who's seen the movie Selena? Right, so I'm Mexican-American. I'm from El Paso, Texas. Selena, played by Jennifer Lopez, love her, is from Corpus Christi, but not far. And there's this one scene in the movie where her father, who's played by Edward James Olmos, and he basically says exactly that. And it's one of the wonders and beauty of being Latino in America is that you are from multiple cultures all in one, all is you, and that's a challenge, right? Like that's a real benefit to be able to know how to talk to different audiences because you in yourself represent multiple audiences, but it's also a challenge that you have to be, as Selena had to be, somebody who appealed to the Spanish language music scene and also in her crossover into English language music. So I think that challenge of being your whole self at work is one that I continue to experience, and that I think early in my career the biggest challenge was not wanting to be pigeonholed into a space where, because of my Latino heritage, I would be assigned only to speak to Spanish language media. And I could do that, and I think that's a real benefit that I can do that, or that I can handle. I worked in political campaigns, or that I could speak to the Univision for the candidate who could not. But I did not. But I could also see some of my peers who would be placed in those opportunities and then never be able to break out and also talk to CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post. So I think in the early part of my career, I was very cautious about not only being led down a track where I would only be doing that kind of work. I wanted to be able to speak to Americans, and Americans are diverse. So I'm still attempting to continue on that route.
Okay, Andy?
Yeah, for me, I think it's sort of the same. I think it was finding those connectors of how do I crack into the industry and how do I get my first job and what that looks like. I was lucky enough to have a mentor in high school, and I was raised in the Bronx. I'm Dominican, raised in the Bronx. So when I got out of college, this mentor, he's not a Latino, But basically, what he did, he placed me in my first job, working for a consulting firm down on Wall Street in healthcare. And I was lucky enough to land there and then work. My boss was Latina, and have a community of Latinos working in that firm who supported me throughout once I got into that placement. So I do think that that was a challenge, but also, being able to communicate in Spanish, I think when I first started 16 years ago, that was sort of a benefit. That started to be a benefit. So I was an asset, I guess, to that team. And from there on, it has always been about having mentors throughout my career.
Caroline? So the question is, so everybody thus far has answered the question as to what have been some of the particular challenges in your initial pathway as a Latino communicator?
Well, I am Carolina. I'm from Spain, and all my career I've done it in Spain. So I just started my career here, and I could say almost 1 week ago. So I've been a professor at CUNY, actually, at BMCC. And my challenge as a Latina, coming from another language, because my career I have done it in Spanish, my challenge was, how can I teach people how to communicate better in a language that is not my native language, right? So I had to all the time take a step back and say, okay, communication is not only about grammar and language, although that's very important, but I had to teach my students how to structure their message, how to deliver a message in a way that sounds powerful, etc. And now, as a communications coach and consultant for a big firm, international, etc., I have the same issues because, of course, English is not my native language, and I am not a Latino in all the senses because I'm from Europe, but I have Latino culture, of course, Latin culture. But my biggest challenge is that how can I say native speakers of English how they should present or speak better in meetings or communicate better? That's.
Now, Erica, you
Carolina.
You mentioned
Erica.
You mentioned something when you spoke that is interesting to me. You talked about the whole self, about the fact that you want to be able to bring your whole self to work and into the discussion around what your firm or what your organization should do. Talk a little bit more about what that means to you. I'd love to hear others talk about that too, because I think it touches on this point around how do we take what we know innately or how we grew up and our experience, and how do we translate that, if you will, into the work experience as a communicator?
Sure. So most recently, I was the head of communications for an organization called Everytown for Gun Safety, which includes Moms Demand Action. It's the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country. And it became the largest after the Sandy Hook shooting, which was a really pivotal moment in our country's assessment of how gun violence affects us. And I think one of the lessons of the last few years, being Mexican American in my workplace, is why is that relevant to saving lives from gun violence? If that is our mission, and it is, how, as a senior leader in the organization, how do I apply that? And in particular, when we know that gun violence has the greatest effect on people of color, and particularly in the Black community. So while I may not be Black, I know that it's like the speakers before were saying, I know what I don't know and how I can get to figuring that out and understanding, which I'm sure many of you have learned in your courses, know your audience and know who you're really whose lives you're trying to affect. So I come to the table with what I know, and I have not been personally touched by gun violence, but, in my community, gun violence, I grew up on the border. And in my youth, the drug wars was a really difficult time. And so that's been in my midst, and I think I want to remember that instead of, I think, earlier in my career where I feel like I was maybe just trying to meet the marks and expectations and not be different. And I think in the last few years of my career, now that I guess it is mid-level and with real experience under my belt, I think that's an asset. And I'm finally, brave enough, confident enough to say that instead of, if not hiding it before, but like trying to prove that I knew how to communicate.
Who else has had a situation where their background has been an advantage in terms of what they're doing in their work?
Well, for me, for example, it's like it impacts everything I do. So most of my work is working for brands and introducing those brands to Hispanic who live in the U.S. So being Latino and having a team of Latino work to introduce a brand or to make a brand more relevant is really important. And working on a team where I'm Dominican, we have Mexicans, we have Colombians, we have Peruvians, where we know the nuances and the cultural nuances for each of those groups, help us guide the clients and those strategies to reach the population.
And if any of you have questions, raise a hand, and there is a microphone back over in this corner back here, but we'd love to hear from you as well. Anybody else?
Well, just like in a similar fashion to Andy, I also do consumer work, and growing up in Connecticut, having an accent, et cetera, and speaking two languages was not an asset at that particular point. It was not until I came into the world of PR, started working in a multicultural brand, specifically tailoring content and initiatives to Latinos, that I actually started seeing that my duality as a Latina, as an American, as a Dominican was actually an advantage. And being able to sometimes not just be able to sit in a room full of Latinos, which my team is, but to be a consultant in general market groups really makes my background a huge asset. To be able to do two works, to be able to conduct general market strategies and Latino strategies, it's an advantage that I have that my general market counterparts don't have. And that's 100% due to my background and where I come from.
And in my experience, I also have a background in political communications. I consulted on political campaigns in New Jersey in my early 20s. And a lot of my experience, I cut my teeth in Hudson County, New Jersey, particularly in Hoboken, New Jersey, which has a big Puerto Rican population. And there's a real dichotomy between mainstream political communications and how you communicate with the mass public versus how you communicate with an ethnic community in a specific part of a neighborhood. And the techniques that you would use, they just don't translate. And the street level, the street level politics, in terms of canvassing, the way that you hold a conversation door to door versus at a person's house versus in public housing is just a completely different conversation, and being able to step into both worlds was definitely an asset.
Yeah. The other thing that strikes me is each of you have advanced in different ways, and clearly you've depended to a certain extent on your culture and your background. Was there ever, I think one of you mentioned a mentor. Andy, you did. Did any of the rest of you have mentors who kind of helped you along at different points?
I'll begin. I've never had a mentor, not a sustained mentor. I've had great teachers. I've had bosses that have been very influential, whether for a year or two, that have taught me a lot of important lessons. But I've never had any opportunity to have a sustained mentor relationship, Latino or otherwise. And I think one assumption is that young Latinos would prefer to have a senior Latino mentor. I don't, at least in my experience, I wouldn't have cared either way. Just someone that would have given me a hand along in my career would have definitely been an asset.
Yeah, I've had great bosses. I've had, people who have looked out for me. It's not exactly mentorship, but when I was in high school, I was really involved in an organization called the National Hispanic Institute, which was like leadership training for young Latinos, and did like summer programs and met a bunch of other like really smart, ambitious Latinos from across the country. We're like, all right, we're in high school, and you think, well, let's all go to college. Let's all go to good colleges, and so there's a community of people who, have similar backgrounds and are striving together, and I think that's been a really valuable part of my career experience.
One of the key messages that Juan had this evening was talking about the need to really be a continuous learner and to also really understand the business that you're in. What key learnings do you have that you would share to the young people in the audience?
I'm thinking.
Yeah.
So my career path has been so eclectic, I would say, because I started out as a speech and language pathologist. Then I got a PhD in linguistics. Then I came to the US to get an MS in public relations and corporate communication. And I had never done that before, although I had coached a lot of executives or politicians for better communication. And I think I would say that if I didn't become more successful in the beginning, it was because I didn't know the business that I was in. So, for example, I became very successful in television because I coached a lot of people from TV and radios. So I became successful at that because I knew their business. I knew that what they needed and how they needed to communicate. But for example, I didn't have a very extended career coaching CEOs, for example, because I didn't know their business. So I think it's really important to not to be afraid to learn and not to be afraid to be being told, no, that's not the way we do that. We have to do it in another way. In other words, we have to be open to mentoring and coaching ourselves if you want to learn, right? So that's
I think for me, working in an agency it means everything. Knowing the audience and knowing the business of your clients. And on an agency side, you work in many different type of clients. So, it could be a technology company, it could be, let's say, Coca-Cola, it could be, there's so many different clients, and the client do expect you to know, one, who their audience is, but how is your communication strategy really impacting their business and their business objectives. So it's not good enough just to say this is the communication strategy, because what you're going to be asked is, so how is that going to impact what our business objectives are? And all of my clients, all organizations are really businesses. Even the Hispanic PR Association, we are a nonprofit, but we have to have a business mentality of how we approach our communication as well, and how we grow our organization. So it's imperative to know both.
I would say that is one of the single best pieces of advice that any young communicator could ever get, to understand your client's business, and specifically understand the business model. And even more specifically than that, understand how they make money. And it might sound trite, but that basic understanding, how do they make money, that directly impacts the type of communications counsel that you give. And I'll give you an example. So managing a crisis for our client, there was a potential cancer cluster in one of their manufacturing lines. A colleague suggested that they shut down the line. That was hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that they just suggested the client stop. Now, not to be insensitive to the potential employee health issue, that was not necessarily the best counsel at that time, or at least going back and giving some reasoned thought as to why you were making that recommendation. My recommendation in terms of understanding the business model is, if your client is publicly traded, pull the annual report, and particularly the 10K, and there's a section called business strategy. They spell out right there how they make money. And if your client's not publicly traded, find a publicly traded similar competitor, pull the 10K, read the business strategy. That tells you clear as day how their business works.
So I'm going to ask one last question, then we're going to go to the next panel. So the last question is, so all of you have had a degree of success. What would you suggest to companies, to agencies? How should they approach developing a more diverse leadership team? Start with you.
Sure. Well, I think I've been on the agency side for a long time, so I'll start there. I'll pick on my own kind. I think number one, it's awareness of opportunity. A lot of kids may not even know that PR is even an option as a career. I certainly didn't. I think ideally, certainly at the college level, ideally at the high school level, in at-risk communities, maybe even go younger, possibly, to make sure kids stay in school and have the aspiration to join. I think also along the way, educational support, so PR, SSA at the college level, and then of course professional development when young Latinos enter the workforce. I think the awareness, the educational support, and professional development, I think those are three key areas.
Coming from an agency, from the agency side as well, I am being in a very niche-specific team. I think that the recommendation I would make would be to pay attention to what's inside your own walls. I think sometimes we are pigeonholed in certain categories, and even the leadership within those agencies and within those organizations don't even understand the capabilities of those diverse teams and those specialty groups bring to the table. Acquaint yourself with your own employees. Try to learn the work that they do and what they actually have to offer.
I think one of the ways that we can diversify, whether it's an agency, I've worked at Ketchum or an organization, is right at the start of talent acquisition. So being really expansive in recruiting and communicating about opportunities within the organization or company, and that when potential new hires are coming in, that you develop a blind skills-based test. So, in my career, as I, grew and became a manager and put myself in a position to be able to hire people, I realized I, like everybody else, have implicit biases. And that some people might interview better, or some people might care about this school or that school, or when you don't actually publicize new opportunities, you're actually just doing network hiring amongst people who tend to be very similar in terms of their backgrounds. So one, we put up jobs everywhere, and we actually seek to put them in environments where we know more diverse candidates will find them. And then two, fine, you've got great candidates, then take a look at their skills by a writing test that actually removes their name, so that you're actually just assessing how good somebody is at their job, and that you are making a selection not based on all of those other things that I think everybody is somewhat influenced by.
So I think as an industry, we do have a challenge corporations have a challenge, and agencies have a challenge of finding talent out there. It is, believe it or not, a small industry in cities like New York or LA or even the big cities. For me, personally, I think you have to get involved in supporting organizations that really drive the growth of the industry. So whether that's PRSA or HPRA, you need to get involved there and support education so that you have a group of professionals that come out of college, and then once you have that group of professionals out of college, you have to find a way to empower those professionals and really find programs to make sure that they're growing internally once they get to your organization.
I don't have a lot of experience in that area, but I did my master's thesis on that subject of, it was exactly female leadership, but what I found was that a lot of times the job postings were very narrow, and they were looking only for the entry-level job postings, they were looking for people with entry-level skills, but those job postings or those assessments maybe are not very useful in the long run, so they don't tell you how the person will be able to develop afterwards. And I think that everybody has a potential to develop to the sky, right? Or the sky's the limit. So maybe other types of hiring methods to be able to know who really could be a leader and what skills does a leader have, instead of just what entry-level person I need to fill this role right now. That's what I thought.
Well, thanks to our first panel. Please give them a round of applause. Now I want to ask our next panel to come forward. Okay, so now we've got Rosanna is here, and then next we have Nicole, then Rebecca, and then Karina,
yeah.
and Eddie. So let me start with an easy question. And the easy question is, what's the one most important thing that you think really prompted you to go into the field of communications, public relations?
I'm trying to think if that is an easy one, but I think it is. It isn't one. So my route to the field of communications came through the arts, and I spent a lot of time doing theater and trying to be an actress and all this. But what eventually prompted me to come into this field is, as an artist, you have a lot of day jobs, and I thankfully ended up at places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and their shops and at Apple. And while I was there, I spent a lot of time thinking about like corporate culture and thinking like how do you communicate different departments internally. So when I found actually the program here at Baruch, I realized this is something I'm very, very interested in. So that, I think for me, it was more just having different interests and really pursuing things that I really hadn't, that I was attracted to, kind of, led me down a path. So.
And what kind of expectation did you have as you went in?
Well, actually, when I first came to the program, I thought that I would be far removed from the arts. And I'm back in a field now, and I'm in a company that does strategic communications, marketing, PR for arts companies. So that was surprising me. Yeah.
So for me, I actually didn't come into the field in a very traditional manner. I went to law school, and my last year of law school, I met the mayor of my city, and I was really into his green policies and asked him if he had an internship, and lo and behold, he did. And so I kind of just stumbled upon this opportunity as his, civic and community engagement liaison. But then he understood my background, my legal background. I had gone to law school. And also my background.
So you knew how to ask good questions.
My background in journalism. And so little by little, it just slowly developed. And at one point, he told me in a conversation about getting the message to the people that if nobody knows about it, it didn't happen. And that sort of like sparked a fire in me. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he just said that. Absolutely, that's so true. And so lo and behold, I then found myself really into communications. And although he didn't ask me, sort of gearing my duties and my responsibility towards getting his message out there. And then I was recruited to go to Capitol Hill, and from then my career just kind of took off, and that's sort of how I landed there. So sort of by chance, but then also an interest that I didn't know I had.
Okay.
I wanted to be a novelist. My mom said, how are you going to pay your rent? And then I decided, well, maybe I could be a journalist and write my novel when I'm, at home. And then I studied journalism and a bunch of other topics because I was interested in everything, and discovered I didn't really have the stomach to be a journalist, but I love the pulse of news. I love the pulse of narrative storytelling. And I went to school in New York City, so I had the luck to have a ton of internships. Started off in a music magazine internship, and then went on to a bunch of other internships, and they were all in marketing and communications and PR, and didn't really know what I was doing, but knew I really liked it. So I graduated with a degree in journalism, got my first job online through, I think, Monster or something. And I wound up at the Financial Times, a newspaper in the communications department, and absolutely loved it. Tried to figure out what exactly I was doing half the time, and eventually figured it out little by little. Decided I needed a little bit more substance in terms of business knowledge and corporate communications and strategy and all these other things that people were talking to me about or around me. And I got my master's degree in corporate communications while I was working, and so very happy with my choice and totally recommend it to all generalists.
So for me, I went into college kind of as a communications major because it was so broad. So I took classes from being in front of the camera to being behind the camera. But what really kicked off kind of my career was, I think a couple of the panelists spoke on it before, but was mentors and people who kind of put me in those places due to just looking out for me. So I started off interning for Cosmo for Latinas, and that summer, just being an editorial intern is a little bit different than being anything in PR. So I asked, hey, can I run the Instagram? Like, can I post something on Instagram? And because of that question, it kind of spearheaded me into my PR career. So from there, working in social media has really propelled me into being able to work for brands or agencies, because PR isn't just, pitching out press releases or sending pitch notes or getting things placed into editorial, which definitely helped me, but social media is kind of what propelled me in there. Never thought that would be a role to be able to apply for, but that's definitely how I got started.
Eddie?
I think for me, it was, I hated the way people of color and Latinos were being portrayed in the media. And early on, I always wanted to do something about it. So one of my biggest passion has been policy in the political world, which I started with Planned Parenthood in their advocacy and political department, and then moved on to work for the Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign.
There are a lot of other people that thought that way.
Working in their surrogates department, pushing out policies and messages for different communities. And then from there, I discovered the messaging aspect of it and knew I wanted to pursue it further, which led me to Burson-Marsteller, doing corporate communications. And my hope is to go back out there and tell the Latino story and the story of people of color in a more positive way that really reflects us.
Now, did any of you have role models as you were pursuing your careers?
Well, so oddly enough, my role model was not a Latina, but Katie Couric for a long time was sort of my role model. I just felt that she really was a true journalist and really represented the people regardless of background, race, color. So for a long time, and still to this day, I really look up to her.
Anyone else?
For me, when I was kind of kickstarting into trying to find a job right out of college, someone who really helped me, her name is Lisette Rodriguez. And the reason why I would say that she was a role model was because she didn't go the traditional route. She worked in the agency setting. She was a senior vice president, but then decided that she wanted to leave all that behind and start her own business. And to me, that was so inspiring and such a way of showing that you don't have to go traditional in the way that you pursue your career, and there's not one set route. So that was definitely a role model for me.
For me, I know I hear a lot about the lack of diversity in communications and how that's a struggle, but I found that when I got to Baruch and when I started interning, that I had a lot of role models. It was, for some reason, to me, the story has been opposite for me in that I feel like I've been embraced. Like Shelly is someone who I would consider a mentor, and I've always felt very comfortable. I know that's not always been the experience, and I feel like I'm benefiting from a lot of people that have come before me. So I feel like Shelly's definitely someone I look up to, and I worked for some time and interned at the Arthur W. Page Society. And the staff there is also diverse, and I think there's a strong focus on letting people bring their whole selves to work, which another panelist said earlier, and I thought that was so wonderful, because it's something that I do feel now.
Well, and I get a sense with each one of you that you have a sense that your experience, your background is actually an advantage in terms of what you do every day. I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit. Rebecca?
Sure. So I guess this is a bit complicated and backwards, but one way someone described me once was as a hidden ethnic. I don't know if anyone else gets this question, but it's the, what are you? You're, how, who? You don't look this way or that way. And I grew up in a town that was incredibly diverse. I mean, 70% Hispanic. So I never really had to define myself. Everyone knew what everyone was. But it wasn't until I entered, I guess, the professional world, and I worked in very corporate settings, and I looked around and, as a quote-unquote hidden ethnic, I guess I became extremely aware of people's perceptions, ignorance, because I heard a lot of comments that I think if I looked more quote-unquote ethnic, probably wouldn't have said in front of me. And so I think that sort of consciousness made me feel that representing not just, Latino and women in general is really important, but also to show not just the diversity of what we look like and what exactly this world culture is, but also to question from a subversive perspective and say, why did you say that? And so I work in a nonprofit now, and we work in over 120 countries. And so this kind of awareness about when you put a person of color or a white person or someone who's ethnically ambiguous on your annual report, what message are you sending? Is this a message of, of empowerment? Are you showing someone in utter poverty? Are you showing them in a good light? When you have someone quoted in a story, is it a CEO with an ethnic surname, and is it a powerful thing? So this just heightened my awareness, I guess, and my my question of not only imagery but authenticity. And I think as a PR professional, we specialize in public perception, and so we really not only can't rely on this idea of pigeonholing people, but I think we also have to have an authentic voice. And as someone who doesn't necessarily look one way or another way, the question of authenticity is personally incredibly important and complicated to me. And I think as a professional who specializes in an industry about public perception, imagery, and shaping public narrative, these are questions that I think about every single day, and certainly inform me as a public relations professional and as someone of Hispanic descent.
So I think, to Rebecca's point, for a long time, especially as a woman, Latina, I would always get these looks of like, how did you get there? How did you make it that far? And I kind of downplayed it for a long time because I felt cornered, I felt intimidated. But I think now, as I've grown in my career, as I've grown as an individual, I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
And I'm proud to let people know who I am, what my background is. And sometimes people don't assume that I am Hispanic or know that I'm Hispanic, but when they learn, they're really intrigued. So I'm very proud and happy to share that with them. And as a panelist that was up here before said, that duality also is sort of something that I embrace 100%. I am American of Hispanic descent, and I use both of those things to sort of advance in my career and in this world, especially in sort of this political landscape that we're sort of navigating through right now. It's a challenge, but I think it's something that is going to be advantageous for us.
But, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
To just jump in about your point about politics, I also think it's incredibly ironic that obviously we're in the state where we're in with Build a Wall and all that, but if you just go back a year ago, remember in the Republican Party there were two two candidates, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who were using their Hispanic heritage as something to boast about. Jeb Bush bragged about, being married to a Mexican American, and so it's very funny that, we're kind of undecided on this, but that just goes again to show political clout. And who we are and who defines this narrative. It's not going away just because there's some negativity right now. It's quite an asset.
But I think as an individual and collectively as a group, we have the power to sort of continue to promote that message of our strength, of our abilities, and things of that nature.
So what do you see as the future for Latina communicators? Eddie?
I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can during the troubling times we're in. But I'm a realist, so I think we have a long way to go. And part of what they were saying is, just a few months ago, certain candidates running for president was using that, Latin or Latino sort of connection as a plus, but that has changed in the last few months. And I think that, unfortunately, will set us back a bit. I do think that certain folks and people in leadership need to put this as a priority to make sure that, it's not just Latinos, but like people of color in general, and particularly women of color, have a voice and have a seat at the table in order to, take back the narrative and tell our own stories. And I think we're in a communications war at this point where, we do have to take it back and we do have to demand that space because it's no longer available to us in the same way that it was a year ago.
To piggyback off of what he was saying about taking things back, I think in working in brand PR, what's really taught me is that general market is our market, and it's really hard to get that across to clients.
It's a new mainstream economy.
Yeah, to understand that all the research that you're doing to try to reach this consumer is the same research and the same stats that pop up for our general market. So taking pride in being Latino and Latina, but not being afraid to say, I am a part of that majority, so who you're trying to reach is already us. So reclaiming who we are in that way.
I'm actually very optimistic. 50% of U.S. population growth in the last 5 years alone has been Hispanic, from Latinos. Hispanics contribute or control $1.3 trillion to the American economy. That's more than the GDP of Spain, more than the GDP of Australia. So whether you like it or not, it's clearly got a lot of money in it, and so we will become a group that's more important to court. Certainly, as I think one of the earlier speakers said, it's not a monolithic group. So I'm actually pretty happy whenever I see online companies like BuzzFeed owns Pero Like, which is hilarious because they put out all these videos, more and more marketing to, or showing the range of experiences. They have videos for people who are Hispanic but don't speak Spanish and kind of mocking or making jokes about what exactly that's like versus, and of course more serious topics. So I'm starting to see a lot more interest from media companies like Even Fusion and Univision. Think about how do you expand and not just talk to people newly arrived or recent immigrants, but maybe people who have been here for a while, who their families have been here for 1 or 2 generations maybe. They're still part of this culture. Luckily, assimilation hasn't completely wiped out everything. How do we include those, people in this narrative? And I'm optimistic. I see lots of changes. Obviously, there's much more to do, but I don't think there's much of a choice. I think you're going to have to start paying attention.
So I'm optimistic as well. I just think that there's definitely room for growth. And I think a lot of organizations, both public, private, nonprofit, there's a big missed opportunity in this sort of sector of the community that is growing so quickly. So I would like to see more, and I would also like to see more diversity within that group. So to communicate that your company is taking part in the Hispanic market. Well, what does that mean? Is it because they speak Spanish? No, it's very different and not monolithic as was mentioned earlier. So I think for companies to hire internally a very diverse group that can help them understand who the Hispanic market is and how diverse that sort of group of people are, I think is really critical.
Yeah, and also to piggyback off what Eddie was saying earlier about the moment that we're in, where maybe possibly groups like us, like Hispanics, may take a hit with just all the rhetoric in the media. I feel also that there's an opportunity for us as a cultural group to work to help correct that and to speak up for it. I know in the arts specifically, I had an experience with two clients recently where they both are in a cultural sector. One is a Native American, the other is a group that's speaking for the history of Black ballerinas. I feel like as a woman of color, I had a specific perspective that was very useful in that, and I do think that as Hispanics, that's something that we can lend to this current time of just difficult rhetoric. There's a lot of complexity in the conversation about culture, and I feel like we can add to that.
Well, I'm going to shut things off, but I have to tell you, after hearing this group and the group before, you have to be optimistic, right? So let's give them a big hand of applause.
Super steep. It was kind of like
quien tocó tu secreto por primera vez y con ternura saudó